listening to Chets and Giggles, our continuing exploration of British crime procedurals and police procedurals. Today we have my fantastic co-host with us, Mr. Scott Davis. Scott, how you doing?
I'm doing just fine. How are you?
I feel pretty good. Oh, by the way, my name is Jed Dixon. Thank you for joining us here at Nevada County Media. I was given a bit of a prompt for today, but before we jump into exactly what my homework assignment was, as it were, maybe tell us a little bit about how we arrived at talking about British procedurals and your experience with that, Scott.
Started in Snowmageddon.
Okay.
Tree fell through the satellite dish, so we had no TV. So we started watching YouTube and Prime and Netflix and everything like that, just for entertainment, because we still had internet.
Who's we exactly?
My wife and I.
Oh, okay, fantastic.
Yeah, we were trapped up in the snow. And so we started watching all of these different shows, and there was a lot of fun ones. Death in Paradise, different shows, and then I stumbled onto some of these police procedural ones.
Sure.
And they're British, so it's like completely different than, Starsky and Hutch.
Yeah, they really take their time with the British police procedurals.
Yeah.
So that we talked a bit about what your passion was, and this is something that you came up with, talking about these shows. I didn't have a lot of experience. I have seen Sherlock, the Benedict Cumberbatch.
Yeah, that's
amazing.
Great.
Maybe a little bit more fast-paced.
Yeah, quite a bit.
But some of those BBC shows, I've heard of Broadchurch and Luther, didn't really have any experience. But we ended up talking about a series from 2013. You may have heard of it. It's called Shetland. And I watched it. I watched the first season, which thankfully was 2 episodes in case I didn't like it. But spoiler alert, I loved it. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience with Shetland?
So I started reading a book by Anne Cleeves. I just pick up books, and it was about this detective on the Shetland Islands. And I have a connection with the Shetland Islands because when I was in the service, we pulled in there one time in the middle of nowhere, and we brought some spies on board and then went back out to sea. And so all I saw the Shetland Islands from was through a periscope. That's all I ever saw, but I thought it was a really cool place. It's very desolate and windswept and what you expect that's so far north of Scotland. Just beautiful. But so I started watching this show, and it was really, really good. It's kind of dark.
Yeah, atmospheric, most certainly.
Yeah, very,
and the
very
music
dark.
helps with that as well.
Yeah. The music is creepy, but it's quirky too. It's kind of quirky, and so I like the show.
As you get to know the characters, they'll have their own journeys they're going through. But of course, there's this through line of a murder. I mean, we're going to say this is a spoiler podcast. I think we can talk about what happens, what the red herrings are, and possibly what the conclusion was.
Sure, Phil.
It's only 2 episodes, so if you haven't seen it and you want to, go ahead and stop right now and watch the show. It's fantastic, and come on back. We're back. Now, amazingly, we're not going to talk about, you just sort of breezed through that you went to pick up some spies, but we're not going to talk about that, your time in the service. We want to talk about this show completely. And they actually bring up the Shetland bus within the show.
I'd never heard of anything about it, and it was amazing. I had no clue that that's what they did.
Can you explain what the Shetland bus is?
Essentially, it was during the World War II and the Nazis that the Norwegians had the resistance, and they needed supplies. And so they would bring them from the Shetland Islands. They could bring them across, and they'd bring money so that they could, buy stuff. And it was just a way to fight the war. But there was a lot of Shetland Islanders who are essentially fishermen.
Yeah.
And they would sneak people over to Norway.
There was the people, a lot of Norwegians were involved in that as well.
And material too.
And material as well as money.
Yes,
which
money,
is a big through line. Where did the money go? Why was there money in the Shetland Islands?
Yeah.
Which for all intents and purposes is a fairly low-key set of islands. They don't have all the amenities that the rest of the UK has, and that's kind of the backdrop as well. Yeah. Something that I've noticed about these police procedurals is that they don't seem to be ready for the level of crime that's happening. Now, you've had more experience watching these.
Sure.
Is that sort of a trope through all these procedurals that Like, oh, this murder happens, and there's a couple people in town that have had experience with it, but most people are going, oh no, not in my small town.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same in almost any small town where you don't expect just these horrendous things to happen, and it did.
Yeah.
It did, and it shook a lot of people. And the police department seems a little bit backwoods, almost like Barney Fife. And
Sure.
Yeah, and they have to deal with all this stuff.
They've got a drunk tank, and they know the local people that are
Essentially, yeah.
And that's about it. It's kind of a revolving door.
Yeah.
So the plot is Jimmy Perez. Am I pronouncing that correct?
Yep.
He's a detective there, and a woman is killed. An older woman who seems to be beloved by everybody, but she's the matriarch of one family, and there's another family that is sort of in opposition to them. She's a matriarch of the poor family, and there's a more affluent family.
Sure.
What am I saying? It's the
Yeah, I don't remember the names.
Haldanes, I think it is. Two different families. So there's a lot of inherent, I guess, struggle or you could say conflict there.
Or Hatfield and McCoy's.
Hatfields and McCoys, very much. So we can talk about some of the red herrings, but you also mentioned that the characters have their own backstories. Who did you find, in particularly, the most interesting of the different characters on the island?
Well, in detectives, Jimmy Perez, because Perez is not a Norwegian name, and it's not a Scottish name. It's a Spanish name, and apparently his ancestors from far back were in the Spanish Armada, and they went aground and they swam to shore, and they lived with the local people there because ships weren't going by all the time, and so Jimmy Perez's ancestors were the Perezes, and so he just continued on through the generations, and he's on this island with the name Jimmy Perez.
You must learn about that in future seasons then. We didn't go into that in season
Well, yeah, did I spoiler alert again?
That's okay. We are going into season 2, 3, 4, and apparently 5.
Actually, 8 now.
Well, I'm not surprised. It's very good. Jimmy Perez is also a widower. His wife has died.
Right.
I imagine we'll go into that a bit more in future seasons.
Yes, you do.
And he has a fairly precarious daughter.
Mm-hmm. And some interesting relationships with people on the island.
Yeah. Certainly. So what exactly drew you to continue to watch this series? What was the first moment you said, oh, this is the one? We could have picked any series we wanted to talk about. You said Shetland. Why is that?
Well, in general, I've been thinking about this. This is why do I like British crime procedurals, mysteries, detective type things?
Yeah, that's the question.
Why do I like it? And I think it's because I'm tired of, I grew up in the United States where I know Starsky and Hutch and I know Perry Mason and all of this stuff. And so that's really familiar. So if you see another one of those shows, it's kind of boring. You know how it goes. This is completely different. I'm not from England. I didn't grow up with those things. And so the stories are different. They tell the story a different way, and I'm not quite sure how to describe how they tell it differently, but it's different. And so it I don't know, it gets me more excited. It gets me interested in it.
It's sort of an atmospheric detective noir, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it
the
is.
The detective gets to meet all these interesting people and put the pieces together.
Right.
There's red herrings here, the red herrings there,
Right.
but ultimately, he's the person that's smartest on the island.
Right, but somebody gets murdered, just like shows in the United States, they get murdered, but they deal with it differently in this story. And Anne Cleves, who wrote the books...
Red Bones, is that what it was?
Redbone, yeah. She wrote the book. She's an amazingly fabulous writer. So she has a whole bunch of series that she's written. I've read almost all of them.
Well, if you want to get into that in a bit later, we most certainly can. But first of all, we have to take a break for our sponsor. Folks, it's been 50 years. Foggy Mountain Music has been in business for 50 years in Grass Valley, so we want to give a shout out and a big thank you. Congratulations to Mary Ellen and the crew over there. That's Foggy Mountain Music on call them and buy a banjo.
Main Street, man.
It's probably on Main Street. I have to admit, I started writing down some notes, and I thought, I want to talk about what is a procedural and how do we talk about it. But I just started writing down like my theories for what was happening in the show. I kind of forgot what we were talking about today, and I just started doing my own detective.
And that's the joy of these kind of shows is you want to be smarter than the detective, and so you want to figure it out ahead of time.
Yeah. So, what were your theories before it all came together? We could talk about the different characters as well.
I did not see the ending. I did not see that. I thought that it maybe was one of the oil workers. Mm-hmm. I thought maybe they were somehow involved in it. I just didn't think of that as being the answer, which is really good because there's nothing worse than 10 minutes into a show knowing who did it.
That's a good point.
I just got to turn it off because it's boring. So I like to be challenged like that.
A few things. There was Ronald, the son, who doesn't seem to be having a very good marriage.
Right.
He's the one who's always in the drunk tank.
Right.
And they thought, a lot of folks in town said, you know what, he probably was out shooting rabbits and accidentally shot this person, Mima, who was the victim. That was one. There's also Paul, I should have this down.
You're asking me. I watched it like a month ago. I can't remember
I watched
anything.
it yesterday.
I can't remember anything.
Paul, the archaeologist who came in from London, and we find out that he has a series of affairs, and maybe maybe someone heard about this affair and tried to shut it down this way.
Right. So I may be mixing stories. So is he the professor?
He's the professor.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Who's having an affair with possibly Hattie, possibly Anna, and definitely Sophie. And then, of course, you have the rich guy who I guess is co-parenting with Jimmy. What was that story?
Yeah, that one's an interesting story. He's like the bigwig on the Shetland Islands.
Yeah.
And he
turns out to be a degenerate. He's the bookie as well for the island.
Yeah, he's the bookie, and I'm not sure if it covered in this episode, and so here's another spoiler alert. And what was his name again?
I believe Duncan.
Duncan, yeah. So Duncan and Jimmy are co-parenting this girl, Cassie.
Yeah, we should have a PDF for everybody just to follow along.
I thought about it.
A family tree.
And then I thought about it, and then I decided not to do it.
That's the thing about the Shetland Islands. Family tree is very thin. It's just
yeah, mostly roots. And Duncan was married to a woman, and they had Cassie. And then Duncan, of course, he's having affairs and all that stuff. So they got divorced. Then Jimmy married her. And then Jimmy was raising Cassie.
right.
And then Jimmy's wife died. And so now they're sharing Cassie. They're both raising Cassie. So Duncan and Jimmy. And it's really interesting, and it's like he has to make nice with this guy who's the bookie and the ne'er-do-well.
Yeah, and he's a police officer.
And he's a police officer, but he has to make good with him because otherwise the daughter has no father, no second father. So there's some chemistry that way.
I'm a co-parent myself, and it most certainly can be difficult.
Yeah, but you have to be nice.
You do. Yeah. When it comes to the kids, you certainly have to.
And you have to overlook some things, which is what they did.
Doing that later today. Anywho, and we're going to. So it seems like we're creating some establishing thoughts about the show. Mm-hmm. But what I'd really like to get into in future episodes is let's talk about each individual character. Mm-hmm. You know, the two folks that we haven't even talked about. Gemma Chan is in this show. I saw Gemma Chan and I was like, oh my God. I met her in the second episode of Sherlock. She's been in a couple MCU films. Mm-hmm. Absolutely fantastic actress. A lot of other folks I didn't recognize, but I'd love to get into their history, how they all came together.
Well, you'll see they're all throughout the BBC shows. You'll be watching this show, and there's somebody you saw from this show. That's all. I don't think there's a huge group of people in the acting pool in England. Yeah.
And I'm hoping that we can use this show as a backdrop, much like they use the big festival as a backdrop in the show, as a backdrop to talk about the police procedurals in novel form. You know, when it started off in TV, like Dragnet, apparently it's the very first detective or police show that was available.
Could be, yeah.
And where it started off in novel form and how it's really grown from there. So Scott, I really appreciate your expertise in this, your curiosity. Yeah, expertise. You just own it. And do you have any parting words for the folks out there that are listening that might be interested in watching season 1 of Shetland? We actually didn't spoil who the killer was, or really anything about that.
It was the butler.
It was the butler.
It was the butler.
The
yeah.
butler on the Shetland Islands. Your fish.
Watch the shows. The British shows are longer, so it's not a 45-minute show. It's an hour and a half show for the first episode, hour and a half for the second. So it's a full-length movie, but you get completely wrapped up in it. And if you do that, I think that you'll become a fan.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us today. Folks, once again, our sponsor is Foggy Mountain Music. This has been Chets and Giggles with Scott Davis, and I'm Jet Dixon. We'll kill you later.